20th Century Nationalism, Unit 8, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. So we're going to start off talking about the liberation of Eastern Europe and the unification of Germany here. Really, here we are here is the end of the Cold War, mid to late 1980s here. And we're going to start looking at some changes that affected the Soviet Union, which wound up having a ripple effect for Eastern Europe. Mikhail Gorbachev, new leader of the Soviet Union, a reformer, allowed for the lifting of the Iron Curtain and the creation of new democracies in Eastern Europe. And what that really means is Gorbachev is going to reverse decades of Soviet policy in regard to the satellite states of Eastern Europe. He's going to allow for the withdrawal of those countries, and again, those countries like Eastern Germany, Hungary, Poland. He's going to allow for the withdrawal of those nations from the Warsaw Pact alliance system. And when the time comes in the late 1980s, he's going to, and this is Gorbachev again, he's going to refuse to use force to keep communism in these Eastern European countries. So this is going to allow for the creation of new democracies in Eastern Europe. Most of those changes that I was referring to began in Poland in the 1980s, early 1980s. We have Lech Walesa, who was actually a union leader who really formed an independent trade union called Solidarity. This force really became the rallying cry for the working people of Poland in the 1980s. And it really became a center of, and the leadership of Walesa as well became a center for resistance to the communist way of life and the enforcement of communism by the Soviet Union. And ultimately, by 1989, free elections took place in Poland, mostly because Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union would do nothing to stop them. Again, if you recall, in the past we talked about movements against communism in countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and even, Poland. And very often, particularly in Hungary's case in 1956, the Soviets were very quick to pull the trigger and crush reformist movements. Gorbachev and the Soviet Union wouldn't do that, and ultimately Solidarity is going to really go from being a trade union to more of a political party. And you'll see the ushering in of democracy in Poland in 1989. This is going to be the first non-communist government in Europe since the end of World War II. And again, this is going to wind up having a cascading effect on the countries of Eastern Europe. Once Poland becomes democratic, the other Eastern European nations are going to demand it as well. And there it is, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. Free elections were allowed by the Soviets, and again, this is Gorbachev refusing to send in the tanks or refusing to lift a finger to stop what the people of these Eastern European countries wanted. Throughout, there were non-communists that were elected. And another thing you see here in 1990 is the peaceful division of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And again, this is kind of an expression of nationalism. People wanting their own nation and a government that is reflective of their ethnic, linguistic, religious, or what have you, makeup. And ultimately, that's the reason why you see the splintering of Czechoslovakia into two nations. Probably the most dramatic example of the end of the Cold War and the refusal of the Soviet Union to lift a finger to prevent the fall of communism in Eastern Europe is what happened in East Germany in 1989. What had happened was thousands of East Germans began leaving for the West. After what was going on in Poland and other countries, there was a great deal of curiosity about whether or not you know, emigration or movement from one country to another would actually be enforced. And what started out really as just a congregating of people around the Berlin Wall in the fall of 1989 really turned into a flood of people traveling over, through, and under the wall to get to Western Berlin. When it became clear that the Soviets weren't going to stop people, the Eastern German Communist government resigned. And this temporary government that sort of takes over lifts all travel restrictions, which really just means that people were free to go from east to west for the first time since the end of World War II. In very short order, the Berlin Wall is going to come down, and this non-communist government that arises in Eastern Germany really sees itself and understands that it's a temporary measure, and it really only existed to bring about the reunification of the two Germanys. So the East German government that comes about with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is really just a temporary measure to assist in the reunification of the two Germanys into one country once again. And there it is, German reunification. Those free elections resulted in governments in Germany that were going to reunite. It was really West Germany's chancellor or leader, a guy by the name of Helmut Kohl, who was going to sort of spearhead the reunification process, which becomes official in 1990. The last of the Soviet troops are going to leave Eastern Germany at that time. The monies are going to come together. The capital of Germany is going to go from Bonn, where it had been the capital of West Germany since World War II, back to Berlin in the east, the traditional capital of United Germany. And a number of programs were set up to help citizens make the transition. And again, this was a difficult transition, mostly because, for 50 years or so, the Eastern Germans were living under a very oppressive system, whereas the Western Germans were living under a more of a free market and free democratic system. So the process of bringing the two sides of the country back together it was not as easy as it might have seemed. And there were going to be significant pitfalls, particularly in the economy. Again, East Germany had a command economy, an economy controlled by the government, where West Germany was an economy that was more of a market-oriented capitalist economy. And bringing the peoples of those two sides together would prove to be a challenge. And kind of the lead-in to that here is some of the problems, right? After achieving liberation from Soviet control, Eastern Europeans faced many problems. Again, we sort of touched upon this one in the previous slide, but the transition to market economies. Again, people who were used to government control of everything had a very hard time with the idea that you sink or swim based upon your own merit and based upon your own business in a market-oriented economy, which is what they basically wanted. So that was going to be a transitional period. Democracy itself was fragile. Remember, particularly people in Eastern Europe, they were, not used to the idea of political expression and true debate, having been oppressed for so long. So that turned out to be a very difficult transition, which is actually ongoing. Pollution. Eastern Europe was extraordinarily polluted. Eastern Germany was extraordinarily polluted, mostly because the communist countries didn't go by the same environmental restrictions and laws that the rest of the free world did. They sort of made up their own way, and as a result, their factories were extraordinarily outdated, and they did belch a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the air and waterways. And there was also nationalism, which in some cases brought people together. The best example is East and West Germany. People wanted the two Germanys to become one. But in other places, nationalism caused rivalries, violence, and chaos. There were examples in Eastern Europe where nationalism actually split countries up. And an example of that would be like what happened in Czechoslovakia. It became two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Now, by the time we get to 1991, we start talking about the end of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and we use the word dissolution mostly because the country dissolved. That's quite literally what happened. It went from being a union of Soviet socialist republics to a collection of smaller nations, the largest of which was Russia, and continues to be Russia, but any sense of union between the republics like Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and so on, any union after 1991 was a thing of the past. And a lot of the reason for the fall of the Soviet Union goes along with really the same reasons why Eastern Europe in the late 80s became non-communist. It has to do with the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a reforming leader, came into power in the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. He was open to democratic ideas, or glasnost. He believed some things needed to change. There needed to be more debate. There needed to be more political expression. It's really how you would define that term glasnost. And then the other major idea, other major tenet of his reform was this concept of perestroika, the reshaping of the economy, basically the introduction of capitalist ideals or ideas into the economy. That's why in the 1980s you start seeing like McDonald's and Coca-Cola in the Soviet Union. The idea was to put people to work for different companies to bring about more prosperity. Um, but ultimately that winds up having the impact of making people want more. And then again, a lot of his open ideas encouraged people in Eastern Europe to demand freedom, which is ultimately what did happen and what we just looked at in countries like Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Now, nationalism could bring people together or it could pull people apart. And in Germany, it brought the two sides together. In Czechoslovakia, it brought many sides apart, and that's what's going to happen in the Soviet Union. Nationalism in countries like Ukraine and Georgia and Russia, for that matter, is going to pry the Union apart. Okay, Gorbachev is going to do what he can to try to keep the Union together, but there was a failed sort of reactionary rebellion against Gorbachev, which really just kind of discredits the communists in the Soviet Union. Ultimately, a lot of that is sort of almost unimportant because the bottom line here is that by 1991, late 1991, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was seen as discredited, was seen as invalid, and the different groups, nationalist groups in countries like Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, they're going to demand freedom and no longer being attached to any form of union. And really, again, by December 1991, you see Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, among others, indicated in the different colors in the map off to the right here. They're going to declare independence. The former Soviet Union is dead at that point, and Gorbachev found himself in a strange position at the end of 1991. He was really the president of a country that had dissolved out from underneath him. He was really president of nothing. So at the end of 1991, he's going to resign his position, and really with the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev, that's really the final death knell of the Soviet Union. And so really, when we speak of the Soviet Union, we're really dealing with the communist state that existed from 1917, in the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, through the leadership of Joseph Stalin, who was really the leader of the Soviet Union from 1928 or so until his death in 1953. In the 50s with Nikita Khrushchev, the 60s, 70s, and early 80s with Leonid Brezhnev, and then throughout the 1980s and very early 90s with Mikhail Gorbachev. So that entire period we refer to the Soviet Union, and after it we refer to this group of nations, including Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, among others, um, that that were that were basically created after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So there were a lot of effects, a lot of things happened as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union. You see the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and that just means the countries that were formed. Again, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on. Um, Really, after the Soviet Union was gone, there was only one world superpower, and that remains the United States. Without two superpowers, U.S. versus the Soviet Union, you can't have a Cold War, so the Cold War was over. Really, it's seen as an American victory in the Cold War. Severe economic hardships in the former Soviet Union, which continue to this day. And again, a lot of the problems we looked at with Eastern European countries trying to adapt to market-based capitalism and political democracy. Um, a lot of those same kinds of problems are going to manifest themselves in the former lands of the Soviet Union. Not everybody was happy about the fall of communism, so there's going to be, conflicts and violence between people who support communism versus people who do not. Some of that continues. Um, and you see a lot of revolution. Where does it stop? You see many of these countries that were created, and then you see, even more revolts inside those countries for different groups who want their own countries. So what you see in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is a splintering effect where does it end? How reflective of whether it's language or ethnicity or religion on the ground, how reflective should these new nations be? How small should they really become? And that some of that is continuing to this day. Throughout the 1990s, we sort of look at Russia here, Russia being the largest of the former Soviet states, Russia, comprising the vast majority of the former Soviet territory. Um, Boris Yeltsin is going to be elected president of the new Russian Republic, which is a democratic system. He's going to introduce a free market system, and again, that's a system based upon capitalist ideals. The government's going to bow out of the economy to a large degree, not going to control prices. Uh, Businesses previously owned by the government are going to be sold to private investors. Um, Ultimately, unfortunately, this is going to wind up failing to improve the economy. It's going to lead to high unemployment, worse health care, malnutrition, economic inflation. And again, these are some of the problems that you're dealing with when you're trying to transition from a command economy or an economy controlled by the government to an economy that is really run by the marketplace, by the people. And many of these things actually continue into the present day as well. Um, and Yeltsin is even going to have to deal with a little bit of a political backlash here. Um, Sort of a revolt by his own parliament. Um, it winds up just being an example of just like there was difficulty transitioning to a different economic system, the political sphere is going to have some difficulty transitioning too. Yeltsin's actually going to have to use his own military to keep control. And anytime you have a president basically using the military to control the government, it doesn't bode well for democracy. So democracy in Russia continues to struggle as well, as it did with Yeltsin, and as it does, in the present day with the next major leader of Russia, who we'll talk about now. That would be Vladimir Putin. Putin succeeds Yeltsin in 1999. Uh, and Putin being a former KGB, which is the Soviet equivalent of the CIA, being a former KGB operative, he's gonna sort of bring Russia a little further away from true democracy. Very powerful leader. Um, Ultimately, Putin has done a number of things in his time in power to sort of be seen as um, an opponent of the West, but he's also done some things to be seen as a friend of the West. One example of being seen as a friend of the West, he has given Russian support in the global war on terrorism. However, what's going on right now in the Ukraine can be seen as Putin trying to reestablish um, a Russian empire of sorts. Right, the people of the Ukraine um, demand freedom, and Russia has taken steps to sort of incorporate parts of Ukraine back into its territory. So the jury's certainly out on Putin as to whether or not he is, a truly democratic leader. And it also goes to show just another example of the struggle that countries face when they're not democratic to institute democratic institutions. It's not always that easy. Okay, shifting gears now eastward, we're going to take a look at China, specifically China since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Um, Unlike Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to reform the Soviet Union by changing the political sphere and the economy, um, the man who's going to succeed Mao Zedong in China, Deng Xiaoping, is going to take a single-pronged approach. He's going to basically leave the political system alone. So, in other words, the only ideas that are tolerated continue to be communist ideas, or the ideas of the established Communist Party in China. But he's going to allow for capitalism and free market economy in China, which is going to change China's economic standing in the world, and we'll take a look at why some of that is now. So really, a little background here is Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union struggled with drastic changes. Communist China moved toward a free market economy while preserving the Communist Party's political power. And again, today, that just means that the Chinese economy is the fastest growing economy in the world. And most of the reason for that has to do with the changes that were brought about by this guy, Deng Xiaoping. After the death of Mao, he's going to become the leader of China, and he's going to seek to modernize China's economy by reform. You're going to see a new legal code and constitution that goes into effect in 1980. Some limited rights to the people, but most of Deng Xiaoping's reforms are limited to the economic sphere. To the point where by the mid-1990s, China had established the world's fastest growing economy, and it did it by selling a large number of products to the West, meaning us. Some of the ways, one of the ways one of the ways Deng Xiaoping went about reforming the economy was by ending a lot of the communist economic ideas, one of which were communes. Remember, communes were these large farms owned and operated by the government, where the harvests were basically collected, and the idea was everybody works for the benefit of everybody else. Those communes were disbanded, and peasants were allowed to rent former commune lands in exchange for the right to sell some of their harvest. And again, when you have the incentive to sell something, you have the incentive to grow more of it. So this is going to really make China self-sufficient in food. It's going to eliminate hunger for the first time in a generation in China. And again, it's just one of the reasons for the surge in the Chinese economy in the last 40 years or so. China is going to begin producing more and more consumer goods after 1980. Radios, television sets at first, and now today you see the entrance into the American market of Chinese products like motorcycles and cars, automobiles. And again, these consumer goods are going to be the driving force behind Chinese economic growth. Another basic idea of communist economic theory is that planners, government planners decide what's produced and what's not produced. A lot of that gets thrown in the garbage after Deng Xiaoping takes over in 1976. Bonus systems are set up, incentives to do harder work are set up, and again, the whole idea here is just to give the people who work in the factories more of a stake in what's produced. If they produce more, they're paid more. Uh, and that's probably the best way to motivate a person to do anything. And for the first time after 1976, China has begun to sort of do that. And again, this really has to do with the introduction of limited capitalism. People are allowed now to own small businesses and hire some workers. Private companies, that is, companies not owned and controlled by the government, um, account for a large portion of China's industrial output today. Um, and again, we have a picture here of a Chinese manufactured car. And that's sort of the idea, right? When people, private entities, meaning regular people, can invest in a business in order to make money, to turn a profit, that's going to wind up driving growth. And that's what's happened in China economically since 1976. Unfortunately, China has not reformed its political system. So that means that, unlike in the economic sphere, elements of capitalism and freedom have been allowed, politically there's been no freedom. The only sanctioned, the only legal political party in China remains the Communist Party. Um, so again, when you think of China since 1976, think economic reform, not political reform. So free expression is not allowed, different political parties is not allowed, political debate in the public sphere is definitely not allowed. And some of these issues come to a head in 1989. Um, and again, nothing happens, nothing in world history happens in a vacuum. 1989, we've already talked about that year, right? 1989 is the year the Berlin Wall fell. 1989 was the year of solidarity in Poland. 1989 seemed to be the year of democracy. And even though the Chinese Communist government has or had attempted to keep information from its people, um, it it was unable to keep the secret of what was going on in the world, and that was the growth of democracy. So in 1989, students who were encouraged by what was happening in places like Europe and the former Soviet Union were congregating in Tiananmen Square, which was just a public park. It was like Central Park in New York City. It was just a public area. They congregated and began to demonstrate and demand freedom and democracy. And this is the college-age students that we're talking about here. And this demonstration lasted for months. They set up tents, they made speeches, and they basically made it very difficult for the communists to control. When the Communist government of China demanded that they break up and disperse, the students refused. And this wound up really having a terrible effect, because Deng Xiaoping is going to order the tanks to fire on the students, so killing hundreds of students. Many student leaders were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. And the outside world looked at this in China with horror. Basically, we were shocked that the Chinese government would actually fire on its own citizens. Um, and because Western reporters had made their way to China, many of this stuff happened on TV. So this made the Chinese government look extraordinarily bad and behind the times. Um, the outside world is going to reduce trade for a short time with China as a result. Um, and it sort of is a lesson here, because if we looked at what happened in Eastern Europe, when people began to climb over the wall, Mikhail Gorbachev would not fire on them. He would do nothing to stop the fall of communism. That was very much not the case in China. Deng Xiaoping was willing to use force to maintain the communist system in China. Here we have some images of the Tiananmen, what's become known to history as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Um, Again, you could see body bags, fighting, violence, sort of the iconic picture over there to the upper left of the singular citizen stopping a row of tanks simply by standing in the way. Um, that picture has kind of become emblematic of the entire problem, that the force and might of the government against the singular expression of an individual. Um, you know, can the government truly extinguish all expression in China? And it looks like Tiananmen Square has demonstrated the answer is no. And even though to this present day China has remained a single party state, meaning only one government, one political party is legal, and that is the communist government, um, questions remain as to whether or not it will stay that way. So, after the death of Deng Xiaoping, we see the leadership pass to Jiang Zemin. And really, what you have here is a continuation of the economic policies of Deng. Hong Kong will be returned to China from Britain after 100 years or so of it being a colonial territory of the British. Um, and again, there's going to be really a continuity here between Deng Xiaoping's policies and Jiang Zemin. Really a continuation in capitalism and free market enterprise, but also a continuation of this idea that China will only allow one political party, and that is the Communist Party. All right, so now we are kind of moving back in time a little bit, and we call this unit 20th century nationalism for a reason. Whether we're talking about the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, or the changes that went on in China in the second half of the 20th century, or what happens in India and Africa in this next section, we're really dealing with nationalism or expressions of nationalism in different parts of the world. Um, and now we're going to take a look at how nationalism affected the subcontinent of India, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. So I'm going to ask you now to sort of go back in time a little bit. We've been talking about really the 70s, 80s, and 90s for the last little bit. Now we're going to really take a look at what was going on in India um, in the first half of the 20th century. So really we're looking at the 20s, 30s, and 40s here. So, and again, keeping that in mind, that the forces at work in world history that were making events happen, things like the world wars, uh, things like the Cold War, were very much in play too in the events that happened in India and Africa in the first half of the 20th century. So the Indian nationalist movement really began in 1885 with the organization of the Indian National Congress. Um, Again, the Indian National Congress really was not universally supported by all of the people of India, because it was seen as a tool of the wealthier, educated Indian people, not of the vast population of people in India who were actually peasants. Um, it was also seen as a tool of the Hindu majority of the Indian subcontinent. So the Indian National Congress although it'll be the primary organ of the creation of an independent India, and when I say independent, I mean independent of the British, who had controlled it as a colony for hundreds of years. The Indian National Congress is going to have opposition, meaning other people in India who are going to demand a different um, conception of nationalism than what the Congress really believed it. Gandhi becomes known as the leader of the Indian National Congress, mostly because of his following amongst India's peasants. And as we said earlier, the Congress had a problem appealing to people who were not wealthier and educated. Gandhi sort of becomes this transitional figure who can appeal to both the educated and the uneducated, the wealthy and the poor. Um, and he's going to do this by resisting British imperialism using nonviolent methods. And really, after World War II, India will become the first major country to win independence, and that's going to set off sort of a chain reaction of what would be in the Cold War, at least, referred to as third world nations achieving the dream of nationalist independence. India's struggle for independence, goes back hundreds of years. But it's really not until the late 1800s, early 1900s that you see the rise of Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was actually an Indian man who was born into the Brahmin class. So he was born into wealth. He was educated in England as a lawyer, um, but he's going to sort of forsake or give up that higher caste and live and work amongst the peasants so that he can sort of appeal to all. That's sort of the idea. And he's going to develop a policy of what's called passive resistance, and that just means, um, if the British use violence to enforce their imperialism in India, it means deal with it peacefully. Do not fight back. Under no circumstances fight back. Um, because the idea is, if the Indian people can show the world that the British are acting as the aggressor, then the Indian people hold the moral high ground. And that was very important to Gandhi, holding the moral high ground, um, which they will continue to do um, throughout the independence movement. So, again, Gandhi is going to refuse to support the use of force against the British, even though there's going to be many people in India, Hindu and Muslim alike, that are going to want to fight back, want to revolt in a violent way against the British imperialists who were controlling their country. But Gandhi was going to sort of steadfastly refuse that. And it's really through this concept of civil disobedience. That just means disobeying unjust laws. Um, you know, an example of civil disobedience would be refusing to pay a salt tax. The British government controlled the salt production in India, which was very necessary for the preservation of food. So by not paying the tax, because again it was Indian salt that the British were controlling, the resource here, again imperialism is all about making money. So if the Indian people refuse to pay the British this tax, the idea is maybe the British will go home. Maybe they won't stay if they're not making money anymore. Um, and Gandhi's going to do a number of things to bring attention to the struggle for independence. Um, Things including enduring long periods of time in jail. He's going to become sort of like a martyr figure, a person who suffers or ultimately dies for their beliefs. He's going to fast or go on hunger strikes to draw attention to the cause and to demonize the British, and to resist them. He's going to do a number of things and lead a number of movements that will really bring attention to India's struggle. One form of economic resistance was um, really this idea of boycotting British manufactured clothing, okay, cotton goods. The idea that Indian people purchase goods, clothing from the British, that keeps the British in India because they're making money. Gandhi encouraged the people of India to make their own clothing at home, something he called homespun. And the idea was make your clothing at home, establish cottage industries, meaning small businesses where the Indian people sort of sell to and take care of the Indian people. Um, and basically, again, it's sort of a form of economic boycott. The idea that if you refuse to partake in something, maybe the British will rethink the law, um, or the practice of selling to the Indian people. So, really, it would be nice to say that all of Gandhi's efforts are what resulted in Indian independence, and they certainly contributed to it, but they're not the only reason. After World War II ended, as we've already said, Britain was extraordinarily broke. Britain could no longer afford a large colonial empire, um, and as a result, by 1947, India is going to be given its independence from Britain. Um, the Indian people had or Gandhi had refused to support Britain in World War II, um, although some Indian people did uh, fight on the side of the British against fascism And Gandhi took some criticism for that, because there was no question that Britain was in the moral right in fighting the Nazis. And Gandhi, um, understanding that, really continued to refuse the fight against the Nazis and fascism, which again it went along with his entire theory, his entire idea of passive resistance. But again, the question was, can you really beat somebody like Adolf Hitler with peace? And it's an interesting question that Gandhi believed you could. It seemed that the rest of the world believed you could not. But again, after 1947 or so, the British realized they were too weak to resist Indian demands for freedom, so India will be granted its Now, a big part of what was going on was the division between the Hindu majority. Remember, most of the people who live on the Indian subcontinent are Hindus, but there was and continues to be a sizable minority of people who are Islamic or Muslim. Um, and that was part of the problem with the Indian National Congress going back too, was that it was seen as a Hindu political organization. So really, Muslims are going to demand their own country, and eventually this country will be born and known to the world as Pakistan. When Britain grants independence to India, it's going to be the Indian subcontinent, that is going to be partitioned into two separate nations. India, which will be a Hindu nation, and then the northwestern and at first the northeastern portions of the subcontinent would become Muslim nations known as Pakistan. The problem with that is not everybody in Pakistan was Muslim, and not everybody in India was Hindu. So when people try to move, it's going to kick off rioting and violence, religious-based violence between these two groups of people. It's going to create tremendous hatred and bloodshed, and it's going to be a problem that continues in India to the present day. For his part, Gandhi was completely against the idea of partition. He wanted India to stay one country where Hindus and Muslims worked together to achieve their goals. Ultimately, that's not the direction that was gone in, and it's something that Gandhi regretted, um, and might have even participated in his own death, because we'll take a look at that now. Gandhi was killed by a fanatical Hindu. He was assassinated shortly after the creation of India and Pakistan. And he was assassinated by somebody of his own faith. Gandhi was a Hindu, after all, and he was assassinated by a Hindu. And the idea behind this is he was assassinated by this fanatic because Gandhi had dared to preach tolerance, the idea that Hindus and Muslims should try to get along with each other and work together to achieve their goals. Um, this is going to be something that some people cannot swallow, some people cannot take. So he'll be killed for his beliefs, and this is something you see very often. Um, when a political assassination occurs, it usually, or not, maybe not usually, but very often occurs because a member of the leader's own group, whether it's nationality, linguistic group, religious group, the member of their own group, it will kill them because that leader had dared to um, preach tolerance of the other group, whatever it happens to be. In this case, it's Hindu and Muslim. Later on when we look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, you'll see that same kind of idea between, you know, Jew and Muslim. So these kinds of things do occur, um, and they continue to occur. Okay, so this brings us to the final part of this unit in this presentation, the section on African nationalism. And again, just as we see nationalist movements and nationalist changes in Europe and in China and in India, um, nationalism has a major, major impact on the African continent during the 20th century. Um, and we're going to take a look at how nationalism has affected the different areas of the African continent over that period of time. Nationalism really took hold in Africa in the period, well, during and after World War I. There was a feeling that after World War I, the nations would be given independence. And again, just a little bit of background here. Remember, during the age of imperialism, when we talked about the division of Africa into different colonies, we talked about the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference when the continent was divided up by European countries. There was a feeling that the destruction caused by World War I would result in independence being given for these colonies. That optimism quickly fades after the end of World War I, when Germany's colonies are simply given to other European nations. It's sort of a feeling that although there was a chance to achieve independence, that chance had been missed. So in the interim period, that interwar period between World War I and World War II, between 1919 or so and 1938 or so, you're going to see the nationalist movement, meaning different groups of people and different leaders in different countries or colonies inside the African continent, really beginning to speak out and organizing movements to create new nations. And you're going to see this new generation of African leaders. We have a number of them here. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Harvard-educated African American, really whose life's work included trying to make all Africans, whether it's Africans in the United States or on the African continent, aware of their cultural heritage. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican who lived in Harlem, stressing the need for the unity of all Africans. This is a concept known as Pan-Africanism, basically the idea that whether you're an African living in the Congo or an African living in South Africa, the fact is you're all Africans. So there's many things you have in common, and that should be stressed. Jomo Kenyatta is going to argue that British rule was destroying his native culture in Kenya. In a lot of senses, Jomo Kenyatta is almost like the African equivalent of Gandhi, because again, dealing with British imperialism in Africa. Leopold Senghor organized an independence movement in Senegal. Nnamdi Azikiwe starts a newspaper called the West African Pilot and is going to urge nonviolence as a method to gain independence. So there you see some of that influence of Gandhi and what he was doing in India as well. So again, really the whole idea of attempting to bring colonial rule to an end in Africa will not find success until after World War II. So sort of what the African people had been hoping for at the conclusion of World War I will come true to some extent after World War II. And for many of the same reasons, we had said that India became independent after World War II because Britain could no longer afford an empire. Well, that applies in Africa too. So you see a map here, independence in Africa. And one thing that the map contains a lot of is dates, right? A lot of years. 1962, 51, 52, 60, 62, 64, 80, 66, so on and so forth. Many nations, many dates. And what this indicates here is the year that these independent countries, in fact, became independent countries and no longer colonies. Independence comes to African nations after Britain and France let go of their colonies after World War II, so most independence comes to Africa in the two decades, the 1950s and 1960s. Ghana is going to be the first one in 1957. Kwame Nkrumah, the leader. They're going to gain independence in 1957. And then following that, 17 new nations will emerge in 1960, 11 more between 1961 and 65, and there's some others in the 70s and 80s as well. But really, it's like a cascading effect. Once one becomes independent, many will become independent. Northern Africa is granted its independence from the French in 1956. France is going to decide to try to keep one of its colonies, Algeria, because there were many French settlers who lived there. Algerian nationalists are going to resist with guerrilla warfare, so there's going to be some fighting there. French President Charles de Gaulle will ultimately declare, grant independence in 1962. So again, these independence movements don't always come peacefully. Sometimes nations try to hold on to their colonies a little too long, as was the case in Algeria with France. Although we see, a multitude of new countries in Africa since the 1950s, they face a lot of problems, and stable political and economic systems have yet to be realized in these countries. And again, the reason that this is in the same unit as the end of communism in the 1980s is because a lot of these countries all share the same problems in their transition to new nations. We said that in Eastern Europe, those countries have struggled to create stable systems, economic or political. Same kinds of things have happened in Africa, although they didn't overthrow communism in Africa. They did overthrow imperialism in Africa, and the transition that has followed has proved difficult for most countries. Um, Following World War II and the declarations of independence throughout Africa, you see a new generation of African leaders. Um, and again, think about that map with all those countries. The African continent contains dozens and dozens of countries, all of which are led by different individuals with different philosophies. Jomo Kenyatta supported capitalism. Julius Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah, um, different leaders of Tanzania, Ghana, and Guinea, respectively here, believed in socialism, which is really a form of communism. So, or a sort of communism is really a form of socialism. But the idea here is that you have varied people believing in varied ideas. It didn't seem that any leader could bring all the African people together. This idea of Pan-Africanism, the sharing of a common identity, it remains more of a concept than a reality because, in reality, um, the political systems and economic systems of these African nations are as varied as the people who live in them. So that is to say, they are extremely different from one another. A lot of economic problems. Um, the old imperialist idea of selling a single cash crop or natural resource, that's going to continue. So you're not going to see a lot of economic diversification. The people who sold the crops are going to tend to remain wealthy, and the people who do not are going to tend to remain poor. Um, and again, the Cold War sort of plays into this a little bit because, when we talked about the Cold War, we said some countries followed a policy of non-alignment, which just meant they took money from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Um, and very often the leaders of these new nations are just going to use that money to buy military equipment to try to take over their neighboring country, or at least to strengthen their own hold on power. So very often money taken from the U.S. and the Soviet Union is going to be used to just create dictatorship throughout the African continent. Add to that the reality that the climactic and geographic diversity of the African continent is going to pose a problem as well. You see droughts and expansive population growth have hurt the economies. Disease such as AIDS has hurt Africa. Um, you know, Developing cities have seen slums occur, or slum developments occur around the cities because urbanization has happened relatively quickly throughout parts of Africa. So again, you see a mixed bag here of reasons for difficulty to occur, whether it's climactic or geographic or ethnic or political. Um, the reality is there's been a lot of difficulty in the transition to new nationhood in Africa from the old imperialist system enforced by the Europeans. See a lot of political challenge here. Democratic governments fail between 1957 and 1982. That means that because, again, just like we see in Eastern Europe, because democracy was not something people were used to, It was easy for the military or single-party systems to take over. And again, a lot of that goes back to the Cold War, dictators borrowing money from the US and Soviet Union, then using that money to purchase weapons to increase their own hold of power. And again, going back to the Congress of Berlin in the 1800s, nationhood itself was undermined because remember, the colonies that were created by the Europeans took no account of the ethnic groups living within them. So very often colonies contained groups of people who had for hundreds of years been at war with one another, different tribal groups, different religious groups. Um, those boundaries that were drawn at the Congress of Berlin by the European powers were arbitrary, meaning they didn't take the people living on the ground into account. They just, it was Europeans dealing with other Europeans and what they wanted and what they didn't want. So the effect here is that you're going to have civil war throughout many of these African countries, which is going to create a very low standard of living for people. Um, so again, the countries included widely different ethnic, linguistic, and territorial groups, leading to war and more political challenge. A couple of examples of that are Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Um, Nigeria is going to be torn apart in the 1960s. Just a brief background with this, it has to do with when the Igbo people fled to the eastern region of the country. General Ajoku organized the rebellion and declared the East an independent state called Biafra. And after 2 years, Biafra was forced to recognize the authority of the central Nigerian government. It just means attempts at independence. So, some failed. You see in Central Africa fighting between Hutus and Tutsis, two different religious groups. Um, Created unstable governments in Burundi and Rwanda. 1994, this Hutu rampage left 500,000 Tutsi dead in Rwanda. And again, the whole concept here just goes back to the idea that people who traditionally didn't get along were placed into these common groups, and then once European imperialism was no more, those groups were basically free to start fighting each other again. Um, so again, this would be an example of a genocide, what happened to the Tutsi in 1994. It would be definitely an example of a human rights violation. Um, and just another example of how warfare has plagued the African continent throughout most of the 20th century. And probably the biggest example of injustice and the legacy of imperialism and the failures of nationalism in Africa has a lot to do with what happened in South Africa in the throughout the 20th century, but really starting in the 1960s. And again, remember, originally the South African political system was dominated by whites who were descendants of the British and the Dutch. Um, the African National Congress will form in 1912. And again, notice that name, African National Congress. It sort of sounds like Indian National Congress, which was happening at the same time. So again, these events don't happen in a vacuum. What happens on one continent affects another. But the ANC begins work. Ultimately, its goal is to bring justice and political power to the black population of South Africa. Um, but by the 1950s, South African whites, who were a minority, but they did have all the political power, we refer to those whites as Afrikaners, had created a legal system which separated blacks from whites. The system was called apartheid. You can see the word apart in it. It literally means apartness. Um, and anybody who's familiar with the old Jim Crow laws of the U.S. South in the post-Civil War world shouldn't have any trouble understanding what the apartheid laws were, because they were essentially the same thing. The idea that um, blacks were considered second-class citizens to whites. The difference between the American South after the Civil War and South Africa was that the blacks were actually the majority. There were lots more black people in South Africa than white people, so this was an oppressed majority. Um, and again, political demonstration against the unjust apartheid laws really begins in the 1960s. And it also results in brutal government repression of those demonstrations, which which we'll look at. So again, just a little background on what apartheid is. Again, it's very similar to the old Jim Crow laws. Education, separate schools for black and whites, and it resulted in superior schools for whites, inferior schools for blacks, separate facilities, whether we're talking about parks, beaches, or transportation. Non-whites had to carry identification papers or passes at all times, which was, again, a violation of civil liberties, certainly, for non-whites. There was a strange set of laws about marriage. There was a fear on the part of the Afrikaner, and that is the white population, that marriage between people of different races would sort of diminish the white people who were there. The idea that there would be less true white people if intermarriage was allowed. So again, laws were passed preventing marriage between black and white. Communally, there were different areas for each race. Very often, the worst farmland was sold to blacks, with the better land being sold to whites. And as we said, in the 1960s, you're going to see a lot of resistance to apartheid begin. You know, it, you see this Sharpeville massacre, which is probably the biggest example of what happened here. 69 people were killed. They were shot in the back, which means they were shot as they were running away by the white government. Nelson Mandela basically comes to prominence with this. He was the leader of the African National Congress. He was arrested in 1962, ultimately because of his participation in the Sharpeville demonstrations. And it's important to make this distinction here, unlike what was happening in India, or what had happened in India at this point with Gandhi and the whole idea of nonviolence, the African National Congress would not hesitate at times to be violent and to organize terrorist activities. And again, it's a different situation what was going on in South Africa. The idea was that this was a minority government brutally repressing, and I mean shooting people in the street. So it's natural, in a sense, to think that violence would almost be a result of this on the part of the people who were resisting the brutal repression. So, and again, Nelson Mandela would be sent to prison for his participation in protests and even some violence, where he would languish for almost 30 years. And again, Nelson Mandela will come back into the discussion in a minute, but really from 1962 until 1989 or so, Nelson Mandela will stay in prison and sort of rework his philosophy about how change should come to South Africa. And again, you're going to see striking by black Africans in the 70s. The Soweto uprising is an example. Trying to enforce Afrikaner language in black schools, the resistance to that. So again, it's a nasty situation in South Africa throughout much of the 20th century, and even to some degree continuing to the present day. Now, again, there it is, 1989 seems to be this turning point year, right? We looked at 1989 at the beginning of this unit, and it sort of seems appropriate that we come full circle here, because 1989 was the end of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism in Europe, in Eastern Europe. It was really the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. You see demonstration movements in China during this period at Tiananmen Square, which were brutally crushed by Deng Xiaoping. But in 1989, you also see the end of apartheid in South Africa. So really, that 1989, in a lot of senses, was the year of democracy. And really, it stems from a realization on the part of the international community that apartheid and oppressive systems have no place in the modern world. So the U.S. and other nations are going to use economic sanctions, meaning refusal to trade against South Africa, and that's going to put pressure on the South African government to do something about apartheid. And what they do is they elect F.W. de Klerk as president, who was a reformer. And he's going to immediately set to work repealing all apartheid legislation. So all the laws that keep blacks and whites apart are going to be repealed or done away with. He's going to be instrumental in the release of Nelson Mandela, who by this time was seen as a hero of the resistance to apartheid and a hero to the black South Africans. So Nelson Mandela and other political leaders as well are going to be released from prison. And de Klerk and Mandela are going to sort of work out a new constitution and try to work out a transitional path for South Africa to become a democratic, multiracial nation. And again, as we've said, these transitions don't always go very smoothly, and South Africa will be another case of this, where, you know, how do you make, how do you create equality, right? The white South Africans, had everything, and the blacks had nothing. So what's going to be required here is taking from the white South Africans and giving to the black South Africans. Nobody wants anything taken from them, so there's going to be some degree of resistance to that. So that's a major problem. Um, 5 years after his release in 1994, South Africa is going to hold its first truly democratic election where people of all races could vote. Nelson Mandela will be voted in as South Africa's first black president. Um, and, and it's the same thing. Same thing we see to some degree in Eastern Europe. Same thing we see in the former Soviet Union. But there's a lot of problems when freedom comes. Redistribution of a nation's resources. That means the whites who had everything are going to have to, in a sense, give some of their wealth or land or whatever it is um, to non-whites, and that's going to cause disputes between blacks and whites. And it's something that gets overlooked sometimes, is that there were disputes between different black groups and different tribal groups, which were very difficult to sort of deal with. So reconciliation between the races and political groups in South Africa will be difficult. Um, but again, economic development, health reform, all of these things will be pursued by Mandela's government with varying degrees of success throughout the 1990s, as was the case in places like Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Um, just as a thing here to finish up the discussion on Africa, society and culture in modern Africa, you're going to see a lot of changes during the 20th century as a whole. Um, Women's rights has come to Africa, although many women have not embraced them because of traditional beliefs. You know, there's been a lot of foreign influence on Africa over the years. Okay, the works of Chinua Achebe um, are an example of an African writer trying to reconcile um, this sort of central divide between East and West, or African and Western world. Traditional African values versus modernity or Western values. It's just an example of how an artistic form has tried to adapt to the modern world. And that's really been the case in this whole unit. We've looked at how change has affected Eastern Europe, how it's affected the former Soviet Union, what has happened in China with economic reform, but the refusal to grant political rights. We looked at India and how the work of Mohandas Gandhi and the Indian National Congress has shaped the new national, relatively new nationalist country of India, and how religious minorities on the Indian subcontinent, like Muslims, have basically forced the creation of Pakistan. Um, and we've also looked at many of the changes that have occurred in Africa since the end of World War II. The development of many new countries, but the problems that those countries have faced as well. So join me next time for the next unit, which will take a look at the Arab-Israeli crisis and a couple other things, as well as modern global concerns. But again, remember, this particular unit, we're dealing with 20th century nationalism and how it affected different peoples throughout the world.